Antwerp fell into Allied hands in September 1944, one of the greatest ports in Europe, captured almost intact. But a port is only as useful as the waterway that feeds it. And the Germans still controlled the Scheldt estuary, turning Antwerp into a locked warehouse with no key. Every day it stayed closed, Allied fuel and ammunition crawled forward from Normandy on overstretched roads, while the front expanded toward the Netherlands and the German border. The solution was not a single charge or one brilliant maneuver. It was a grinding fight through flooded polders, narrow dikes, mined causeways, and coastal guns, where a small defender could slow an entire army. And the most dangerous twist? The battle that reopened Antwerp didn't begin at the docks. It began in mud, rain, and drowned farmland, at the exact moment speed mattered most. In late summer 1944, the Allied advance out of Normandy turned into something close to a pursuit. German formations withdrew fast, roads filled with broken units, and the temptation was obvious. Keep pushing, keep momentum, keep the enemy from rebuilding a line. Then Antwerp arrived, captured with its port facilities largely intact, seemingly a logistical miracle waiting to happen. But Antwerp was a paradox. A deepwater port could solve the Allied supply problem, yet supplies could not simply appear on the docks. The ships needed safe passage up the Scheldt, a long tidal river system flowing from the North Sea past Dutch and Belgian shores. If the estuary remained under German control and mined, Antwerp was functionally useless. The stakes were immediate and unforgiving: gasoline for armored exploitation, artillery shells for sustained pressure, bridging gear for river crossings, spare parts, winter clothing, medical supplies, everything that turns a frontline advance into a campaign. The Allied supply system was already strained. Normandy beaches and captured ports farther west could not efficiently support the growing distance. Trucks drove long loops, burned fuel to deliver fuel, and wore out faster than they could be replaced. A delay of weeks wasn't a clerical problem. It was the difference between operations that could be fed and operations that would stall. Here's the first open loop. If Antwerp was so critical, why was the Scheldt not cleared immediately? Because September 1944 was a month of competing urgencies. The Allied front was broad, opportunities looked fleeting, and priorities collided. Deep thrusts, airborne operations, and the push toward Germany all demanded resources. In that window, the German 15th Army and associated coastal defenders used time like a weapon. They retreated into terrain that punished attackers, fortified key choke points, and sowed mines and obstacles that would make every crossing expensive. Now the task of clearing the Scheldt fell primarily to 1st Canadian Army, reinforced by British and Polish formations. The geography they faced was not dramatic open battlefield, no sweeping tank duels, no clean lines. It was a lowland maze of canals, dikes, causeways, and flooded fields where visibility was short and movement was limited to narrow strips of raised ground. In that landscape, an advance often meant pushing down a single exposed road with water on both sides, while defenders sat behind mines, booby traps, and pre-registered artillery. The battle's central tension wasn't just German resistance, it was time. Every week Antwerp stayed closed. The Allied front paid interest in fuel and lives. To open the estuary, several interlocking problems had to be solved. The south bank of the Scheldt, around the Breskens Pocket, had to be cleared. The land approaches to South Beveland had to be forced, because that peninsula guarded the route to Walcheren Island. And Walcheren itself, bristling with coastal guns and fortifications, had to be neutralized to make the channel safe for shipping and minesweeping. The first phase on the landward approach became a hard fight around places like Wensdrecht, ground that controlled access to the causeways leading toward the peninsula and the island. The Canadians were trying to pry open the door to South Beveland. The Germans were trying to hold the hinges. The weather turned foul. The ground turned to mud. Flooding reduced maneuver to a few narrow approaches. Mines turned every step into a calculation. For the defenders, this was ideal. A limited number of routes meant they could concentrate fire, re-infiltrate through gaps, and counterattack against units forced into predictable corridors. For the attackers, the question became how to apply force without being bled white. Methodical progress preserved manpower but consumed time. Speed promised surprise but risked disaster on exposed dikes and open approaches. And behind it all was the logistical clock. Without Antwerp, the Allies were feeding an enormous army through a system designed for a shorter distance. The result was a growing mismatch between operational ambition and logistical reality, an imbalance that would become more dangerous as winter approached. Antwerp looked like the solution, until the Scheldt made it clear that ports don't matter if the sea lane belongs to the enemy. While the struggle built on the approaches, another critical piece of the Scheldt puzzle sat across the water, the Breskens Pocket, a wedge of German-held territory on the south bank. As long as it remained, it threatened any movement up the river, and it anchored German defenses that could strike at attempts to open the channel. Clearing it would demand obstacle crossings under fire, especially the Leopold Canal line, and fighting through flooded countryside that offered almost no cover. This is where the terrain dictates the story. A canal in a flat landscape is not just water, it is a wall. Steep banks force attackers into predictable crossing points. Defenders can pre-sight machine guns, mortars, and artillery on the far bank. If the surrounding area is flooded, attackers can't simply spread out. They must build a bridgehead in a small strip of dry ground, then widen it under fire. Operations began with hard, incremental steps, crossings, bridgeheads, engineers fighting the clock with bridges and ferries, infantry trying to hold ground that could be measured in houses and hedgerows rather than miles. It's easy to imagine that such a battle is purely tactical. But every small gain had campaign-level meaning because it shortened the distance to the estuary's key points. As October wore on, the shape of the problem sharpened. If the Allies could clear the south bank and seize South Beveland, the last and most fortified obstacle would remain, Walcheren Island. Walcheren was more than land. It was the gatehouse to Antwerp. It held coastal batteries covering the approaches and threatened any attempt to sweep mines from the channel. Even if the land battle succeeded, ships could not sail safely until those guns were neutralized and the water cleared. That leads to the next open loop. How do you attack a fortified island in a flooded estuary while keeping momentum? The answer involved engineering, amphibious capability, and a decision that carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. The closer the Allies came to Walcheren, the more the campaign stopped looking like a chase, and started looking like a siege in miniature. By late October, the logic of priority became unavoidable. Clearing the Scheldt was no longer a supporting task. It became the key to sustaining everything else. That meant concentrating resources, amphibious vehicles for flooded terrain, artillery to break strong points, air power and naval gunfire where available, and deliberate planning for obstacle crossings. It also meant accepting that this would be slow, ugly work. Exactly the kind of fighting that could drain an army that had hoped to keep moving. South Beveland itself was defended along canals and narrow approaches, with the Slowdam causeway, the thin strip linking the island, standing out as one of the most dangerous pieces of terrain in northwest Europe. Causeways are perfect traps. Defenders can rake them end to end, and attackers have little room to maneuver. Any failed assault piles casualties in a confined space and leaves units disorganized under fire. As Allied pressure tightened, the German position became harder to sustain, but not because the defenders ran out of will. They ran into the arithmetic of being outgunned and outnumbered, yet still capable of delaying the timetable. That was enough. Delay was the objective. And now the module's central cliffhanger begins to form. Even if South Beveland is forced, and even if the causeway to Walcheren is reached, the estuary still isn't open. Walcheren's defenses must be cracked, the coastal guns suppressed, and the waterways cleared of mines. The port problem becomes a combined operations problem, land, sea, and air, and the calendar is still turning. Mini cliffhanger, end of Module 1. By the end of October 1944, the Allies had pushed through the polders and onto the approaches to Walcheren, close enough to see the last gate to Antwerp. But the final obstacle wasn't just German infantry. It was an island built to command the sea lane, defended by heavy guns, and surrounded by water that was mined and unforgiving. The next decision would determine whether Antwerp opened in weeks or stayed locked into winter. And the decision involved deliberately changing the island itself. In autumn 1944, Antwerp's port was captured intact, but the Scheldt estuary remained under German control, making the port unusable. First Canadian Army and attached British and Polish forces fought through flooded lowlands, canals, and narrow dikes to clear the south bank and force the approaches to South Beveland. The goal wasn't just territory, it was time. Every day Antwerp stayed closed, Allied supplies crawled forward from Normandy, slowing the entire front. By late October, the Allies were at the edge of Walcheren, the fortified island guarding the estuary. But reaching the gate was not the same as opening it. Now the campaign would hinge on how to break an island designed to stop ships and men alike. Walcheren's defenses were not a single line, they were a system. Coastal batteries covered approaches, fortifications were integrated into the dikes and dunes, and the island's terrain made movement predictable. If attackers landed in the wrong place or with insufficient fire support, they could be pinned against seawalls and inundated ground with nowhere to go. The Allies faced a brutal calculus. Walcheren had to be neutralized, but a conventional assault could be costly and slow. The island's defenses were strong, and the defenders could shift along interior roads and raised ground. So Allied planners looked for a way to reduce German mobility and force the defenders into isolated pockets. This is where a controversial, consequential method enters the story, breaching the sea defenses to inundate parts of Walcheren. Flooding would limit German movement, restrict counterattacks, and shape the battlefield for amphibious landings and commando raids. But it also meant flooding civilian land and towns, creating long-term damage. This wasn't a clean tactical choice. It was a strategic decision about time versus cost, made under the pressure of an entire front supply crisis. The twist is that to open Antwerp, the Allies didn't just fight the terrain, they changed it. As operations moved into their decisive phase, the battle became a combined effort. Land forces pressed and fixed defenders. Naval and amphibious elements prepared landings. Air support and artillery attempted to suppress batteries and strongpoints. And engineers, always engineers, worked to make movement possible where nature and mines had made it nearly impossible. Walcheren's assault operations were not a single dramatic landing but a sequence that had to work together. If one landing failed, it could strand units and leave the estuary still closed. If landings succeeded but coastal guns remained active, minesweeping would be dangerously slow. If minesweeping lagged, the port would remain unusable even after the island fell. Every component depended on the others. On the mainland and along the approaches, continued fighting pinned German forces and prevented them from concentrating against the landings. That pressure mattered because the defenders' best chance was to mass local firepower at the beaches and gaps in the seawalls. If the Germans could keep the attackers bottled at the shoreline, Walcheren would become a graveyard of stalled landing craft and exposed infantry. In this phase, victory wasn't taking an island, it was turning off the guns and making the water safe. When amphibious assaults went in, the environment dictated everything. Weather could disrupt air cover. Visibility could complicate naval gunfire. Tides shaped landing windows. Flooded ground limited movement off the beach. Even when troops got ashore, they often fought along narrow raised lines where every meter was contested. The defenders, meanwhile, were not fighting for a symbolic last stand. They were fighting for hours and days, exactly the time needed for mines to remain in place, for the estuary to stay dangerous, and for Antwerp to remain sealed. For the Allies, the operational objective was not merely to clear enemy units, but to clear them fast enough to unlock logistics. This is the turning point moment of the overall story. The campaign's purpose shifts from advance and exploit to secure and sustain. Once the Scheldt became top priority, the Allied effort reorganized around opening the port rather than chasing the front line's farthest edge. It's a subtle pivot, but it's the kind that decides campaigns. Armies don't collapse because they lack courage. They collapse because they can't feed the next week of operations. Walcheren's defenses were reduced through a combination of assaults, supported by heavy fire, and relentless pressure against fixed positions. Strong points that might have held for months in a static war were forced to fall in days because the attackers could concentrate resources and accept no delay. And as the defenders were driven back and captured, the estuary's most immediate threat began to diminish. Rehook, The battle's hidden enemy wasn't just the German 15th Army, it was the calendar and the tide. But even after the fighting on land turned in the Allies' favor, Antwerp did not instantly become a functioning supply miracle. The water still had to be made safe. The Germans had mined approaches and channels, and minesweeping is slow, technical, and dangerous, especially if enemy guns still have any reach. This is the less glamorous but decisive phase, the transition from won the battle to open the port. Minesweepers and supporting naval units had to clear routes while managing the risks of weather, residual defenses, and the sheer density of obstacles. Meanwhile, port facilities needed to be organized for the incoming flow, ships scheduled, docks managed, onward distribution rebuilt. A port does not deliver supplies by itself, it becomes valuable only when the entire pipeline, from ship to depot to front, works. This is why the Battle of the Scheldt matters beyond its tactical map. It is the story of operational tempo, how fast an army can move, and how quickly that speed collapses when supply lines stretch too far. It's also a story about priorities. The Allies captured Antwerp early, but the use of Antwerp was a second battle entirely, fought against geography, fortifications, and mines. The most important port in northwest Europe was captured in days, then captured again in weeks. Once the Scheldt was cleared sufficiently and minesweeping progressed, Antwerp finally began to fulfill its promise. The payoff was strategic. Supply lines shortened. The road network behind the front became less overloaded. Fuel constraints eased. Ammunition and heavy stores could arrive closer to the armies that needed them. That shift didn't erase the challenges of winter fighting, but it changed what the Allies could attempt and sustain. The broader campaign impact is easiest to understand in the negative. Without Antwerp functioning, Allied operations were constantly at risk of stalling. With Antwerp open, the Allies had a logistical foundation to keep pressure on Germany into 1945. The Scheldt didn't produce a single dramatic collapse of German defenses the way some battles did. Instead, it enabled the kind of sustained power that wins campaigns, steady resupply, consistent movement, and the ability to exploit opportunities when they appear. And it left a legacy that modern militaries still understand. Infrastructure is a battlefield. Ports, bridges, canals, and the trustworthiness of routes can be as decisive as divisions and tanks. The Scheldt is proof that logistics is not the background of war. It is the bloodstream, and if it is cut, the strongest army can slow to a crawl. The Battle of the Scheldt reopened Antwerp and restored Allied operational tempo when it was beginning to falter. It cost time and lives in some of the hardest terrain in Western Europe, but it removed a strategic chokehold the Germans had exploited simply by holding the estuary and mining the channel. Antwerp did not end the war overnight, but once it could finally feed the front, it reshaped what the Allies could sustain, and it helped set the conditions for the final push into Germany. If this story proves anything, it's that the war can hinge on a place most maps treat like a footnote: one estuary, one island, one decision to make the waterway usable again. If you want more campaigns where logistics and terrain quietly decide the outcome, like, share, comment, subscribe, and turn on bell notifications. Comment prompt: which mattered more at the Scheldt, the choice to prioritize Antwerp, or the hard methodical clearing of the estuary's defenses?